This is lesson 10 of Mahraj and Sifat series. In this lesson, we'll tackle one of the most controversial letters, Ra. We'll learn its exact Mahraj, technique, and some of its misconceptions and bad practices. First of all, the sound linked to this letter has the most possible variations among all languages. That's why there are many phonetic symbols, each representing a variation of that sound that is different from the other, depending on where they come from. Notice how they might sound similar, but still they are different. Ara, arra, agha, ara, ah, and so on. So depending on what your mother tongue is, you will have a certain variation of that sound in your mother language. And the first thing that you must learn in today's lesson is not to compare your variation of this letter to the Ra you will use in the Quran. So it is not a good idea to say that it looks like or it sounds like this or that Ra. Even some Arabs trill their Ra, ar-Ra. And that too is not how you pronounce the Ra in the Quran. So if this is completely new to you, it is important to prepare yourself to learn a brand new sound without building upon other previous experiences. This is the best and the shortest way to learn Ra properly. Now, how is Ra pronounced in the Quran? To pronounce Ra properly, two organs will make contact with each other, the tip of the tongue and the alveolar ridge. Ra, Ra, Ra. We'll first focus on the frontal part of the tongue and dive deeper to understand how and where exactly does this contact occur between the tip of the tongue and the alveolar ridge. Let's start with the tip of the tongue. To understand which part of the tongue exactly is used, we'll compare Ra to the two neighboring sounds, Lam and Noon. When pronouncing Lam, this much of the tip of the tongue makes contact with the alveolar ridge. So this whole part is pressing against the alveolar ridge, producing the L sound. And when pronouncing the Noon, this much of the tongue makes contact with the alveolar ridge. So this tiny bit presses against the alveolar ridge, producing N sound. When it comes to Ra, it is somewhere in between, specifically this area. The comparison with Lam and Noon, which are produced perfectly by most people, should give you an indication and a reference as to how much of the tip of the tongue should be making contact. So by feeling how much you use for Lam and how much you use for Noon, finding somewhere in between, this is exactly what you need for Ra. Now, for the alveolar ridge. Where exactly in the alveolar ridge should this part of the tip of the tongue be touching? Again, in reference to Lam and Noon. We pronounce Noon from behind the Lam. So Noon is closer to the mouth opening than Lam. And we pronounce Ra from behind the Noon. So Ra is closer to the back of the upper front teeth than Noon. In other words, closer to the opening of the mouth. So they are not pronounced at the same Mahraj, but they are very close to each other. Noon is behind Lam and Ra is behind Noon. So, in that exact position, this much of the tongue makes contact with the alveolar ridge. The closest tongue placement to the Ra in the Quran is the voiced alveolar tap, which is found in American English in words like city and witty. Again, this is only about the placement of the tongue. It has a completely different technique. So this is the exact location of the Mahraj of Ra. What about the technique? Are we pressing or leaving a gap? Is it a continuous sound? And what happens to the back of the tongue? Well, first, that highlighted area from the tip of the tongue is slightly pressing against the alveolar ridge. So there is pressing, except for the head of the tip, which is not pressing at all and left free, enabling the air to escape through it. Just like what we see in this chart. This is the part where air escapes, creating the sound. Ar, ar, ar-Rahman, ar-Rahim, mustaqar. If this entire area of the tip of the tongue is pressing, without this tiny space for air to escape, it will cause the tip of the tongue to flap, producing the trilling, which is not exactly what you want in the Quran. So this sound is generated when this entire part of the tongue is pressing without any gap for air to escape from. Second, the sound of ra may be extended. Not that we want to use it like that in the Quran, but it is possible. The technique should make it possible. Ar. It is also a good way to practice your tongue placement and technique. Third, the back of the tongue. Since we have two versions of ra in the Quran, a heavy ra with tafkhim and a light ra with tarqiq. For the heavy, full mouth ra, and this is the more common one in the Quran, the back of the tongue is raised, which is the case for any letter with tafkhim. Ra'a, marad. But with light or empty mouth ra, we notice that the back of the tongue is not raised, which creates that light sound. Qadir, ar-rih. Finally, there are some things to avoid when practicing and learning ra. First, ra does not involve any lip movement, so shaping your lips as O when pronouncing ra is wrong, because it adds a hint of dhamma that should not be there. Second, some call or compare the sound of ra in the Quran to the English word raw. And while it might sound close, the English R is a vastly different sound with a different technique and pronunciation. In the English R, the tongue is curled back with a completely different movement and point of articulation. So do not use that method, since it will only lead you further from where you want to be, and your ra will not sound correct as well. Third, ra in the Quran must contain some trilling, but too much of it is also not good either. Without it, there is no ra. In fact, each ra needs one trill, which is something that we can hear in these examples. Ra'a, ra'a, kharaj, kharaj. So there is one trill. Similarly, when ra has shadda, one ra ends with the trill that the other starts with. Ar-ra, ar-ra, ar-Rahman, ar-ra, ar-Rahim, ar-ru, ar-ruh. Exaggerated trilling or takrir is what you should avoid. Ar-Rahman, which actually indicates that there is more than one ra in this word, which is not the case. In the end, if there are people who cannot perform ra sound at all, there are some exercises and workout routines for the muscle of the tongue, which could help you perform the Arabic ra properly and naturally. The same exercises are actually used to help those with a lisp in the ra sound. Let me know if such exercises are needed, then I'll prepare a separate lesson on that topic, insha'Allah. Thanks for watching. If you want to start reading and understanding the Quran in Arabic, then you should start your journey right here. And don't forget to check out my latest book, which goes perfectly with this free course. I'll leave the links for all of them in the description, so check them out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.